Welcome to this video about the pros and cons of the 7700 code. For the record, I'm filming this on January 26th of 2021. This is going to be a very short and simple video. There's not a lot here. The stuff that we do have is somewhat important though. So let's go ahead and get started. So to talk about the 7700 code, what's the first place we're going to go to? The 7110.65. There are really four sections of the 7110.65 that talk about the 7700 code in any meaningful way. The last three, you'll notice 10-2-7, 10-2-8, 10-2-9 are all a very similar topic, and I'll simplify those when we get there. But we're going to start with 5-2-7, and to do that, we're going to jump right in. 5-2-7 is about emergency code assignments. So it says assign codes to emergency aircraft as follows. A, code 7700 when the pilot declares an emergency and the aircraft is not radar identified. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I think that one's definitely a judgment call, and there are absolutely cases where I would not want controllers to do that. B says, after radio and radar contact have been established, you may request other than, so anything other than, single-piloted helicopters and single-piloted turbojet aircraft to change from code 7700 to another code appropriate for your radar beacon code environment. And there are two notes. So the code change based on pilot concurrence, the nature of the emergency, and current flight conditions will signify to other radar facilities that the aircraft in distress is identified and under ATC control. So another facility who sees somebody squawking 7700, if you tell somebody, again, other than single pilot helicopter, single pilot turbojet, to come off the 7700 code, that lets other facilities know that that airplane is under ATC control. And then point two, or note 2, pilots of single-piloted helicopters and single-piloted turbojet aircraft may be unable to reposition transponder controls during the emergency. Let me talk about a couple things there. So first of all, number one, the single-piloted helicopters and single-piloted turbojet aircraft is the right idea, but I think it's a little bit too limited. Okay, the single pilot operating IMC in a piston twin, they are absolutely up to their eyeballs in various kinds of emergency situations and so on. Okay, and it just might take them a little while to get off the 7700 code and so on. So I like the principle. I just think controllers need to use a little bit of judgment. And so the phraseology underneath it, and I didn't highlight it, says radar contact, at such and such position, if feasible, squawk, and then some other code other than the 7700. Just in general, controllers, calm down. The 7700 code, and we'll talk about this in a second because there is a legitimate downside to using it in certain cases, but if it's just a nuisance to you and so on, your nuisance is less important than the workload of a pilot experiencing an emergency. So just let it be a nuisance for a minute before you make sure gently that they are able to change codes when feasible. But go back to A for a second. Code 7700 when the pilot declares an emergency and the aircraft is not radar identified. Let me ask a question. Can we do that for something like a single pilot helicopter or a single pilot turbojet aircraft or a piston twin or something else, right? I mean, in principle, use a lot of judgment. And again, I think controllers generally do a good job, so I'm not going to make a big deal about this one. But don't be too quick to have somebody squawk 7700 in particular for one very specific kind of emergency. For a VFR in IMC, so if you have a VFR pilot who ends up in IMC when they present to us, we don't have them radar identified, practically the worst thing I think a controller could do in that case is have them squawk any code, whether it's 7700, whether it's some discrete code, an ident, even an ident. What happens is when a VFR pilot gets into IMC, that is such an immediate threat unless they get the airplane basically straight and level that I would not ever want a controller to have the pilot turning their head and start manipulating the avionics, typically in the center portion of the instrument panel, to squawk 7700 or some other code or even an ident and so on, or start pushing the soft key buttons on their PFD computer display right in front of them. I want them concentrating on just keeping it basically straight and level. So this is more like step 2 in that case. Somebody presents VFR and IMC. Okay, can you maintain basically just straight and level flight? I don't know where you are right now, but for just a few seconds at least, are you straight and level, according to your instruments? Yeah. Okay, can you stay on that while I have you go on a code? Yeah. Okay, then you can put them on the 7700 code or ident or some other code and so on. Okay, I would not just follow that one by rote. All right, and then paragraph C or subsection C says the following must be accomplished on a Mode C equipped VFR aircraft which is an emergency, but which no longer requires the assignment of the 7700 code. And here it varies a little bit between en route and terminal. So if it's a VFR aircraft and they're on 7700, that's a non-discrete code. And my understanding, I could be wrong, especially for the terminal environment, but my understanding is that the MSAW processing is not going to occur because it thinks, all right, it's a VFR airplane. They're responsible for their own terrain separation. If we enabled MSAW processing, we'd get false alarms all day long. So because of that, in the terminal environment, you need to assign a beacon code that will permit terminal MSAW warnings. So if the pilot voluntarily went over to the 7700 or you asked them to squawk 7700, either way, there is a valid reason for getting them off of that in these cases. In the en route environment, there's an appropriate keyboard entry that will enable that airplane for MSAW processing. Okay, again, keep in mind though, for a VFR aircraft with an emergency, and we're concerned about whether they're going to provide their own terrain separation, that is likely a VFR in IMC kind of situation. And I really don't want controllers having a pilot be turning their heads, because if they turn their heads, they might lose bank control of the aircraft, and it's kind of a catch-22, but if they're already down low, they're at real risk of getting into a CFIT accident. So in the short-term, controllers, even though we're not getting the MSAW alarm going off for VFR in IMC, who is also quite low, which can certainly happen in a scud running situation, my personal recommendation is that you just know what those altitudes are, and you're going to have to provide appropriate warnings for the aircraft without the MSAW backing you up. Now that might just be very short term until you can make sure that the airplane is going to stay essentially straight and level, with an emphasis really on just keeping the wings basically level. And then, again, assuming for discussion purposes that they're on the 7700 code, so we have to get them off of it. Then, once we're assured that the airplane is essentially straight and level with the wings basically level, then you can have them come off of it. So I'm absolutely endorsing this in principle. I just want to recognize that for VFR and IMC situations, there is something special there. Okay, the other three sections of the .65 are on page 440. And here we have 10-2-7 VFR aircraft and weather difficulty, 10-2-8 radar assistance to VFR aircraft and weather difficulty, and 10-2-9 radar assistance techniques. And essentially this is really for VFR aircraft and weather difficulty. So these three sections are all about VFR in IMC. And I've already done a separate video where I asked the question of, is the .65 wrong about VFR and IMC? Short answer is yes, or I wouldn't have asked the question. But among the things I talk about here, and this is the most inconsequential thing that I talk about in that video, I point out that this exact same verbiage about getting a VFR in IMC off of the 7700 code so that MSAW processing can begin occurs in all three paragraphs. That's just redundant, and it repeats itself, and it's redundant, plus we don't need it, and it's redundant, okay? That's just silly. So my recommendation, it's not a big deal. If we're going to get rid of, say, two of these, so we keep at least one, even though it's identical to what we already saw in 5-2-7, I would recommend getting rid of it in 10-2-7 because we're not even to the radar assistance section, so why put a radar thing in there? So I'm just going to take that. I'm going to move the opacity to 100% and get rid of it for everybody. And then radar assistance techniques, no point in being redundant and repeating ourselves here if we've already had it in this radar assistance section. So we're going to get rid of it here. Okay, so that takes care of the 7110.65. We're going to look at one other thing. I'll keep this one pretty simple. This is, and I'll just, on the PowerPoint, NTSB Safety Recommendation A-09-112. A for aviation, 09 for 2009, 112 because it was the 112th recommendation in that year for aviation stuff. It's a 4-pager. It's not a big deal. This is one of the many safety recommendations that grew out of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, the so-called miracle on the Hudson flight. You're welcome to read through this. The short version is that at the time, the software was not set up so it would display the discrete code that an airplane was on as an emergency. I'm a center controller, not a tower controller or approach, but so please forgive me if I'm wrong here about the Tracon side of this. My understanding is the Tracon side of this has changed, and so it's better now. However, I have an ongoing concern, even though, and here's the recommendation down here in the lower right, A-09-112. There's just a little bit more follow-up here on that 4th page. By the way, if you go to the NTSB's website, you can track these things, and I have a small request for the NTSB. Here's what that request is. See this thing called Carroll query? You can go to an investigation or safety recommendation data. This is a safety recommendation, right? So if I go there, it takes me to this page that says you need to go to Carroll. Okay, so you click this Carroll thing, and it takes you to this page where you can access Carroll. I'm just going to hit the NTSB home. Okay, or you can just hit investigation and it takes you to the same page. Okay, and you can click recommendation. It seems silly. Anyway, A-09-112. Whoops. There we go. Hit enter. It'll come up in a second. Here is that, and click there on the left, and this brings it up. By the way, this was closed with an acceptable action from the NTSB's viewpoint. I think that's an airplane. I'm a center controller, so I'm not sure if that's what they look like. And this was closed way back in 2014. Having said that, there's a long series of back and forth between the NTSB and the FAA. We are going to skip all of that. As always, you're welcome to read on your own. The basic bottom line is this. The FAA did point out that especially for the terminal environment, okay, it can now process the discrete transponder code of an aircraft experiencing an emergency as if it were an emergency transponder code. And then the NTSB said, okay, thank you very much, and we find this acceptable. I'm going to ask very respectfully that we consider going a step further, and here's why. Again, I do speak from a center perspective, and that colors my comments a little bit. I think when we have an emergency situation, okay, it's useful for not only that facility to know that there's an emergency going on, but for all sectors and surrounding facilities to know that there's an emergency going on, in part just so we know that whatever controller is working that aircraft is going to have a spike in the workload. And so maybe if we're feeding them airplanes, we need to be aware that they're probably a little busy right now, and they might not answer the shout lines as quickly as they might normally do, and they might not take handoffs in the way that we would want. And it's useful for other sectors and facilities to know that, even if those other sectors and facilities are not directly involved in handling the emergency. Also, the same thing, I think, happens from a center's perspective when we have an airplane making an emergency descent. Sometimes there's a whole lot of coordination that has to go on. If we can process it so that an aircraft's discrete beacon code can be processed as if it's a 7700 code for ERAM and display that way, not only for within that center and to surrounding centers, but also to the underlying approach controls. That way they see some airplane descending out of 18,000 feet or whatever, making a very rapid descent, and they get a heads up so that when we maybe call them to do whatever kind of coordination, they've already got a head start. My concern is not so much pilot workload as it is controller workload in those first couple minutes after an emergency begins. And there can be just an overwhelming amount of coordination that has to be done. So not a big deal. I just would like to see, in principle, this one, even though the NTSB is fine with the current state of affairs, I would like to see this improved, at least at the center level with ERAM. My understanding is it's going to cost a few bucks or a couple $1,000,000, so it's a little over my pay grade, but that's what I'd like to see. Finally, we're just going to finish on a lighthearted note. So this is strictly just for fun. I'm going to ask this question. So what if you mean to tell a pilot to squawk 7700, but you get the number messed up, and so you instead say 7600 by mistake? If you do that, will the pilot stop talking to us? In other words, if they go to dial 7600 in their transponder, does that turn the radio off? Well, short answer is no, and I can't vouch for what other pilots would do, but if I'm in an emergency, I squawk I'm in an emergency, I'm not radar identified, and you tell me to squawk 7600, you know what, just for fun, I might go away and find another controller because I'm not sure about how competent you are. So that's clearly tongue-in-cheek. I'll keep talking to you. I appreciate the help when I fly and I have an emergency. So thank you, and have a good day.